we hope that the volume that Yafa and I edited will also open up further avenues for research and make people more curious to investigate Shia communities today, in particular Shia communities that are placed in Muslim minority context. Well, the name of the book is Shia Minorities in the Contemporary World: Migration, Transnationalism, and Multilocality. And the book very much resulted from a conference I organized a couple of years ago, and the book is co-edited with my colleague Yafa Shanaik. And the idea was that the majority of research that has been done on Shia communities in the contemporary world has looked at the particular situation, the presence in Muslim majority countries. I mean, as you know, Shias are minorities in most parts of the world, even in most parts of the Muslim world. I mean, with the exception of Iran, Iraq, Bahrain, and Azerbaijan. In all other countries, Shias constitute minorities, sometimes significant minorities. So the idea of the conference and the idea of the book was to shift the attention to Shia minorities who are placed in non-Muslim contexts, who are placed in Muslim minority context. So Shia communities in Europe, in Western Europe, in North America, in South America, in Southeast Asia, where Muslims constitute minorities and where Shias themselves are part of this minority. So in a sense, there are a minority within a broader Muslim minority. And the idea of the book is to bring scholarship together of people who have worked on these Shia communities in Muslim minority contexts in different parts of the world. So we have contributions on Shia communities in Germany, in the UK, in the Balkans. We have contributions on North America. We have a chapter on Shia communities in South America. We have contributions on Shias in Sri Lanka, in Cambodia and Indonesia. So it's an edited volume, a total of 12 different contributions by different authors, bringing their particular expertise, their regional expertise, their knowledge and research they've done in a particular area, and looking at Shia communities in this particular area. And the starting point, I mean, the introduction that Yafa Shanaik and I wrote is sort of more to set the context of this volume. So there is some basic introductory information on Shia Islam and the diverse manifestations of Shia Islam across the globe. And then we're also exploring how transnationalism becomes manifest in Shia Islam, how transnational connections have played an important role in Shia Islam historically, in particular the transnational connections of clerical networks, the connections that exist between major Shia clerical leaders, Maraja Taqlid, and communities across the Shia world, and how in the last sort of 40 years, these transnational connections have further developed, because they play quite an important role in understanding the global spread of contemporary Shia Islam and the particular dynamics that shape Shia communities in different parts of the world. So there's an introduction that sort of set the context of this particular volume. And then we have three parts, each with 3 or 4 contributions. So the first part is called Localizing Global Shia Minority Spaces. And this part includes contributions that look at ways how very local, very specific Shia communities are shaped by global dynamics within the wider Shia world. So there's a chapter in there on Shia communities in Indonesia, looking in particular at their connections to Iran, to the seminaries, the Hausa and Qom. We have a chapter on Shia communities in Argentina, in the capital, Buenos Aires. And we are, the chapter illustrates, quite interestingly how the Islamic Revolution, how the political activism of Khomeini is sort of embedded in Latin American anti-imperialist politics and made relevant to a very specific local context. We have a contribution on a different type of Sufi tradition. So the book does not solely focus on Twelver but we have contributions on Alevis, on Bektashis, on other, if you like, more esoteric groups within Shiism. So we have a chapter on Bektashis in the Balkans and how they define their Islamic identity, and also a chapter on Iraqis in London and their connections to Iraq. The second part looks at transnational sort of Shia trajectories. So the aim of this section is to understand how transnational networks, how transnational links operate in the contemporary Shia world. So there is a contribution on the use of the internet and how senior clerics, based in Najaf, such as Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani, how they use the internet to reach out to their communities globally. We have a contribution by Noor Zaidi, who looks at South Asian Shiis or Shiis of a South Asian background in North America, and how they identify with Iraq as their spiritual homeland. So, their parents or grandparents came from Pakistan, but they don't really identify with their parents or grandparents' country of origin, but Iraq as, the place where the major Shia shrines are located, where the shrine of Ali is, of Imam Hussein. These places are much more important for South Asian Shiis, young South Asian Shiis in North America, and they refer to that to these places as their spiritual homeland. As I mentioned, we look at movements within Shia Islam of different backgrounds. So there's a chapter on the Ahl Haq, which is again a kind of an esoteric movement coming from Iran and Kurdistan, and the chapter investigates how it is sort of placed in France and its activities in France. And then the final part of the book, which contains 3 contributions, looks at the fluidity of sectarian boundaries. I mean, there is a lot of focus in more recent scholarship on Shia Islam, on sectarianism, and there's a strong emphasis on, if you like, confessional notions of religious difference. And the 3 contributions, again, looking at very specific local case studies, question these sectarian boundaries and illustrate their fluidity. So there is a very interesting chapter on Shiis in Sri Lanka, which also investigates patterns of conversion, because the majority of Shiis in Sri Lanka are, if you like, Sunnis who converted to Shia Islam. And what is quite interesting, these converts, they wouldn't really be comfortable with using the term conversion, but they would rather talk about a reorientation, because they said, we didn't change our religion. We are still Muslims, but we changed or we moved from one particular understanding of Islam or one particular articulation of Islam to another. And many of these Sunnis who embrace Shia Islam have a strong Sufi background, and there's a lot of cooperation happening in Sri Lanka between local Shia communities and Sufi traditions that are based there. There's another contribution on Shia communities in Germany, and the chapter illustrates quite well how different types of Shia communities that are quite different, Alevis, Nusayris, Twelver Shiis, cooperate in Germany, organize activities together, and overcome the differences, the quite significant doctrinal differences that exist, by organizing events together, by sort of forging a common identity that revolves around the veneration of the Ahl al-Bayt. The final chapter of the section looks at Shias in Cambodia. There's a small Muslim minority in Cambodia. I mean, Cambodia is primarily a Buddhist country. They're called Shah Muslims. And many of them claim to be descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, claim to be Sayyids. And there's also a movement among these Cham Sayyids to convert or to embrace Shia Islam. And again, these converts would say we haven't really changed our religions, but as Sayyids, as people with a particular connection to the Prophet, as being part of his Bayt, as being the Ahlul Bayt, when we embrace Shia Islam, we're not really changing our religion, but we're sort of rediscovering our actual roots. The final chapter in this book is written by Mara Lakeman, who's done quite a lot of research on Shia communities in West Africa, in particular in Senegal, and she acts as a kind of discussant of the entire volume, summarizing, discussing the various chapters, the themes that emerge out of the different contributions, and also brings in her research on Shia communities in Africa, which is equally important, and we felt had to be addressed in such a volume that intends to look at the Shia communities in minority contexts across the world. So we felt the African experience also had to be included. Now, in terms of results, I mean, a good academic book, I would say, raises more questions than providing answers. And we hope that the volume that Yafa and I edited will also open up further avenues for research and make people more curious to investigate Shia communities today, in particular Shia communities that are placed in Muslim minority context. I mentioned sort of one topic that emerges, sort of one of the findings, and that is, the issue around conversion, where in those parts of the world where we have, Sunnis or people who are part of a Sunni minority in a country like Cambodia or Sri Lanka, when they embrace Shia Islam, they would be very reluctant to describe their change of, if you like, religious identity as a conversion, but they would rather talk about a reorientation or tajdeed, like a renewal or revival. So that's sort of one theme that emerges. The other theme, which I think is quite important, and I mentioned this already, is about overemphasizing Sunni Shia sectarian differences and the kind of the way how these differences are increasingly politicized, both in public discourse and in academic research. And again, we've got very, very interesting case studies from a variety of very different contexts, from Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Germany, where these differences are not that important, where Shias and Sunnis share in their particular area a common heritage of venerating the Ahlul Bayt, where they have developed particular traditions and rituals shared by Muslims of all backgrounds around the veneration of the Ahlul Bayt. So this is, if you like, a second sort of point that the volume raises, that these boundaries, in particular in very local context, can be very fluid. The final result, perhaps, relates to a particular term that appears in the title, multilocality, and what all these contributions argue, that the Shia communities we are investigating in this volume have multi-local connections. So there are obviously placed in a particular local or national context, and that very often plays a very central role in how they articulate their identities, how they engage with wider society. They're obviously transnationally connected to, if there are migrants, to their countries of origin or to the countries of origins of their parents or grandparents. But, and I think that is quite important in a Shia context, they are also connected to Iran and Iraq as the two major centers of Shia Islamic scholarship, as the places, and in Iraq in particular, where many of the shrines of the imams are located, and they're very much affected by developments in Iran, by developments in Iraq. And I mentioned how younger South Asian Shias in North America would identify very much with Iraq as the spiritual homeland. So again, if we want to understand contemporary Shia communities, we need to be aware of the various multi-local connections. They are placed somewhere. They have, if they're migrants, they have connections to their countries of origin, but equally important are connections they feel and they entertain to Iraq and Iran as, if you like, the kind of the traditional heartland of Shia Islam. Yes, I mean, the book is primarily an academic contribution, so it wants to broaden academic research on contemporary Shia Islam by bringing in together expertise from very specific regional, local context, of people who've done research, quite extensive research among Shia communities across the world. So it's primarily an academic contribution. So it's primarily targeting students, graduate students who have an interest in contemporary Shia Islam, in the global diversity of Shia Islam, also researchers, obviously, who are working for this. And then we also hope to attract, students and researchers who are interested in questions around transnationalism, global religious diversity, the migration of religions, sort of diasporic religions, by sort of bringing in the particular Shia experience into the equation, which very often is lacking, in particular when it comes to research that is happening on Muslim minorities in Europe or North America, for example, which very often has focused on Sunni Muslims. So we want to sort of tell the Shia side of the story. At the same time, we hope that the book might have a broader appeal. I mean, it's written for an academic audience, but again, what do we know about Shias in Buenos Aires? There's a chapter in the book that tells the story of this community. What do we know about Shias in Sri Lanka? There's a chapter that presents the particular challenges that Shia communities in Sri Lanka face. And there are other case studies which we usually don't have on the map. We are usually not aware of when we talk about the contemporary Shia Muslim world.